You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Radio MMT respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting, the Wurundjeri people, and we are broadcasting to the Kulin Nations. Our focus is economics, that is, how stuff is produced and distributed. We recognise that for many tens of thousands of years, First Nations people's connection to country successfully embodied the world's oldest continuous economy, which was catastrophically disrupted by genocide and displacement. We acknowledge that we have much to learn to reshape our current extractive and exploitive system to achieve sustainable prosperity for everyone.
Radio MMT. Economics for the rest of us with Anne
and Kev. Radio MMT. Looking at the world through the lens of modern monetary theory.
Radio MMT. Macroeconomics for a well-being economy.
Macroeconomics? Isn't that incredibly boring?
No, Kevin, it's incredibly interesting. It's all about who gets what and why.
Who gets what and why? Okay, I'm in.
RadioMMT@gmail.com.
Incredibly interesting macroeconomics for the rest of us. Welcome to Radio MMT. How are you today, Anne?
It's strange that you ask. I'm a little bit warm. I was hoping the aircon would be a bit cooler in the studio today.
You came running in very late.
I did have to jog about half the way here today.
And when I quizzed you, you said you were coming here and you were looking at a bird or you got distracted by a tree or something.
I thought I left you plenty of time and then I just ended up looking at the end of the summer flowers.
Yes, well, you're here. That's good. Otherwise, I would have to do the show by myself, which I can do, but it's no fun.
No, and I am looking forward to today's show because I know that you have got a lot to say, so I'm very interested to hear what that's going to be.
Well, we're reversing roles because normally you're the studious little... what do you call it? The nerdy research buff that does all the homework, and then I just come in and lob grenades and throw them at two bobs worth. And today we're swapping roles. You've got nothing prepared.
I've got no notes. Thank you for joining us as we do take a look under the hood, basically, of the economy using our favourite tool.
Yes, well, this week, dear listener, I'm going to try and give a critique of neoliberalism from an MMT perspective, and essentially I'm going to try and condense 10 years of MMT understanding.
Has that been that long, has it?
I've been doing this. I was with the ALP and then I left the ALP when I started finding out about MMT and joined the AWP, and that was all 2015, 2016.
That's what knowing a bit of MMT will do to you.
Yeah, don't be distracted. Don't go down that rabbit hole.
Well, I need to know this, Kevin, or what's wrong with the neoclassical or the mainstream economics, because this week I found myself in the position of explaining to a person who I do greatly admire and respect why it was not a good thing to talk about barter in relation to money, the history of money. And I actually kind of said something like, it's just ends up perpetuating these terrible harms on the populace. Do you think I was overreacting?
No, and we're going to go into all of this. We're going to have a good critique of neoclassical economics, and it starts right at the beginning with the barter myth. So we're ready to launch into this.
Let's do it.
Okay. To start with, we need to understand what neoliberalism is.
Okay.
And neoliberalism is the current economic ideology that we function under. It aims to maximise the economic potential of individuals, so it's profit-driven, okay, and it's important. And this is achieved by focusing on the private sector activity and entrepreneurialism. Okay, the private sector, according to the neoclassicals, is hindered by the impositions of government, such as tax and regulation. So therefore, government activity should be minimised. And this is achieved by balanced budgets, because if you have a balanced budget, if you are restricted by balanced budgets, you can't spend more than you tax. That's what they reckon. So the government spending has to equal tax revenue. And they're always saying we need balanced budgets. Now, if you're restricted like that, there's only so much you can do. Okay, now that's neoliberalism. My definition of neoliberalism. Incidentally, the whole way through this is my distillation of information that I've received over the years. We'd love feedback from the listeners, email us on, what's our email address?
radiommt@gmail.com.
We want feedback. I want you got critiques. I want to hear them. So I want to bounce this off everybody. Okay.
Can I put my two bob in already?
Yep. Sure.
Just on a definition of neoliberalism. Are we still going with that?
Yeah.
It is like those main things, isn't it? It's like deregulation, so that's getting government out of the way.
Yep.
Privatisation, so that's thinking government can't do things efficiently, the private sector can.
Yep.
Less tax, although sometimes it seems to be only the top 10% that get less tax.
Yeah.
And that's also about getting government out the way.
Well,
isn't it?
less tax, especially for business, because taxation is is regarded by business as a hindrance, and if they were taxed less, they would be more productive, and that would be good for the economy. This is neoclassical economics, right?
So neoliberalism is both a political and an economic ideology in that case, because it translates from the economics into policy.
Yes, I would say that it's a political interpretation of how the economy should be run. Okay, it's run, and this is very much from a business point of view. And they say that this is the trickle down thing. They say that if business is running well, then that's good for society and the economy because it'll all work for everybody else.
Right.
Let me tell you why that's fundamentally flawed.
Let's hit him.
Okay, so let's apply the theory. Now, this is indisputable. All money comes from the RBA in two ways. So all Australian dollars emanate from the Reserve Bank of Australia, the government's central bank. It's not the private sector's central bank, it's the government central bank. They come into being in one of two ways, through government spending, so that when the government spends on defence, social security, infrastructure, all that sort of stuff, it instructs the Treasury to instruct the RBA to credit accounts. And that's all that's required to make that money come into existence.
So crediting an account means you're typing numbers into a computer so that those numbers appear in somebody's bank account in the non-government sector.
If you've ever received a tax return or a Medicare rebate or any money from the federal government, you received it when somebody from the RBA credited your account with a computer.
On a magic money computer.
On a magic money computer, as Elon Musk would say. So that's the first way. The second way that money is created is through bank credit. And this is an arrangement that banks have with the RBA. Okay, it comes from one source, the Reserve Bank of Australia, in two ways, through government spending or through bank credit. Now, if we assume that government spending and taxes are balanced, then all excess reserves must be removed from the private sector. And this will become apparent further down the line. So we're starting from a position of balanced budgets. We're saying that miraculously we've brought government debt to zero. Now, to do that, that means that all reserves that are in the private sector are now removed because they've gone back to the government to bring government spending into balance.
What's a reserve?
What's a reserve?
I didn't know what a reserve was when I first started with MMT.
So all the money that the government spent into the economy and they didn't tax out again is left in the economy as, let's call it money. Okay.
Reserves are a kind of money.
Yeah. So to balance the budget, all that money that was spent into the economy by the government then has to be returned to the government, and we now have not just a balanced budget for this year, but we have erased government debt. But to do that, we've had to take all the money out of the private sector and give it back to the government. Okay. And this will become more explainable, more understandable as we progress. Okay. So here we are. We've got no government debt, and we've got a banking sector. So bank lending is underwritten by the RBA. If there are no excess reserves in the banking system, and there's not now because we've cleared government debt, so all the reserves are gone. Bank loans are facilitated by the RBA lending, for all intents and purposes, reserves into private banks via the overnight corridor rate. Okay, so you go to the bank, you say, I want a $100,000 loan. That commercial bank says, we'll go to the RBA. They will credit us with the necessary reserves so that we can lend you the money for your $100,000. Okay, that's the arrangement that all commercial banks have with the RBA. That it's not from deposits; it's from their association with the RBA.
It's from their charter, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah. That's what underpins all bank lending in Australia. So one part of the misinformation that's spread is that is that banks lend out their deposits.
Right. As if I put my $100 into the Commonwealth Bank and then somebody else has borrowed it.
Yeah. Now, as was very easily explained to me, no bank manager, no loans manager ever has ever checked the balance of their bank before approving the loan. All a loans manager has to do is check to see that you are creditworthy, that you are capable of repaying that loan. Mm-hmm. Once you reach that criteria, they will make the money available. Now, in the current system, they've got excess reserves, but we've wiped them out because we've balanced the books. Now they just go straight to the RBA. So the RBA facilitates the commercial bank to lend you the money. You lend the money and then you pay it back over time. So the RBA charges the private bank, who then mark up that rate for the commercial rate, keeping the difference, which covers the operational costs and the profit. So the overnight cash rate is, 3 or 4%, and then the commercial rate will be 6 or 7%. So the commercial bank keeps the 3% as their operating costs. That's their profit, and then they pay back the RBA. Now, why the RBA needs to be paid interest is another.
It's another question, isn't it?
It's a question for another day because
Yes.
they obviously don't need the money. So
when you hear people talk about the RBA putting up the interest rate they're putting up is that cash rate, isn't it?
Yeah,
That we don't really see. It's the wholesale rate, really.
Yeah, so when the Governor of Reserve Bank adjusts the interest rate, that's the overnight. That's the corridor. They have a top and a bottom rate, and the banks operate within that corridor. That's the overnight cash rate. That's then marked up as so that the banks can make a profit on top of that. Okay, so banks are essentially subcontracted by the RBA, which is the government's central bank, to check the creditworthiness of customers, and then to time shift spending decisions of those customers.
Ooh, what does that mean?
Well, that means that a customer comes in and they say, look, I'd like to buy a car or a house. I will have enough money to pay for this over time, just haven't got it right now. If I had to wait until I saved all the money, You'd
be walking everywhere like me.
You'd be
running.
walking everywhere, and you'd be moving into your house just in time to be shuffled out and put in a nursing home.
Right.
So what bank loans do is they allow people to time shift their spending decisions.
Compared to when they're earning.
Yeah. But they're time shifting the money that they're going to earn over a lifetime, not the money that the bank's earning, but that they're going to earn. Okay.
That's one of the great powers of money.
And we've spoken to Phil Lawn about that. He explained that's where I got that concept from. Makes a very good idea. Okay. So let's say you create a loan of $100,000. There's $100,000 new dollars that come into the economy. However, the money has to be repaid, and that loan attracts interest. So the $100,000 new dollars goes into the economy, and you then pay $100,000 back to the bank, and what's left? Nothing. Okay, and that loan attracts interest. So it's not adding money to the economy in aggregate after the loan has been repaid. The consequence of this is that each loan, when repaid, requires more money than was lent to complete the transaction. So every loan costs more than the money that was initially created to facilitate that loan. There's no fallacy of composition in this. Okay, so every bank loan creates a drain on the private sector. All bank loans in aggregate, when you add them all up, they've
got to be more than the total earnings, don't they?
You have to pay back the principal, and you have to find money in the economy somewhere to pay the interest, and that interest facilitates the operation of the bank. Every loan creates a drain on the private sector economy. So if that was the only source of money available, the economy would collapse because you'd end up with a system where you couldn't find the money to pay the interest.
Where does that extra money come from?
You could maybe borrow it from another bank and then pass the bill down the line, and it would accumulate more interest, and you'd end up with essentially a Ponzi scheme. And if you were left at the end, the whole thing would collapse.
Yes, and I think there are people out there who do worry that it's a Ponzi scheme because they have seen that part of the system.
Yeah. Now this also this doesn't just apply to the banks, this also applies to customers. So if a customer takes out a business loan, they need to be able to repay the loan, repay the interest, and then find money in the economy to make a profit. Okay? But none of that money is created in the banking system because on aggregate, the banking system creates a drain on the economy. It doesn't bring new money in. It just time shifts the money that you're going to earn in the future.
But Kevin, it's the private sector that creates wealth.
Okay. So yes, the private. We are told by neoclassical economists that it's the private sector that needs to drive the economy. But from this, we can see quite clearly that the banks do not bring any money into the economy to pay their own interest to facilitate profit for anybody to make any savings. The money has to come from somewhere else. So banks are not giving institutions, they are lending institutions. They time shift spending decisions of their customers who need to prove that they can repay the principal, repay the interest and make profit or savings from the money obtained in future from outside the private banking system. Okay. Now, one thing that we recognise in MMT is that we recognise that all savings have come from government deficits, right? But I'm thinking from this that it's more than just the savings. I'm thinking that it's profits and running costs as well. But I'm not going to go into that, right? The main point from this is that every loan creates a drain on the economy because it requires more money than is lent to complete the transaction. And that money has to come from somewhere, and it can't come from within the banking system. Okay, it has to come from somewhere else. Banking in the economy as one source of the RBA introducing currency into the economy is only there to time shift spending decisions of people who are going to earn money from somewhere else.
Why does the government sort of subcontract it out or franchise it out? Like, why doesn't the RBA just make all the loans?
Well, that's a very good question. You could ask the Curtin Chifley governments who in 1948 wanted to nationalise the banks, because I reckon they were more MMT orientated back then than we are now.
I think they understood things a bit better in some way.
Well, they just come out of World War II, right? So they've been spending all this money hand over fist. They must have understood that the fiscal capacity of a government to spend, because they've just been through wartime, they've mobilised resources from everywhere by creating money and spending it into existence. They would have had a pretty good understanding of the system under stress. And this is a Labor government. I don't know much about...
No, I'd love to know more about the history of banking in Australia. So it was the Chifley government, they created the Commonwealth Bank, is that right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Not sure. We might need to enlist the brains trust of our listenership to email us, radiommt@gmail.com, and fill us in. I mean, all banks do is they're doing this credit check for the government, and then they add an expense onto somebody who needs to take a loan. So if you want to buy a home, all banks do is credit check you and then add costs. Every loan requires more money than it raises.
Ultimately, it's a drain.
Raises to facilitate that transaction. One source of government, of the RBA creating money, is through bank lending, but that source creates a drain on the economy. It doesn't add money to the economy. It creates a drain on the economy. Now we're going to take a break, dwell on that, think about that for a bit, and we'll come back and we'll start talking about the other source of government of money creation, which is through government spending.
Fucking years old.
It's not about getting drunk only.
It's the only group with a very keen sense of how very, very short life is.
You're listening to Radical Radio 3CR.
So that was a grand love theme by Kid Loco.
I enjoyed that.
Yeah, it's nice.
I was just
wasn't it?
like floating along.
Yeah, you were. I was watching you. You were
Floating around the studio.
doing liturgical dancing. No, you weren't. Okay, questions, Anne. What
Well, during the break, while we were listening to that, it did get me thinking about if the Reserve Bank of Australia is underwriting the commercial banks. So anytime the commercial bank gives out a loan, the Reserve Bank says, yes, we'll back that up with dollars. Why would the commercial bank care whether or not the loan gets paid back if the RBA is giving them the dollars?
Because they have to. That's part of the regulation. That's part of government regulation, which the neoliberals hate.
Something we could dispense with, do you think?
Yeah. And that's what a large part of the Banking Royal Commission was about. When the banks weren't adhering to their regulations, and I have personal experience of this. I know I applied for a loan in 1992 when I was buying a house with my partner at the time, and they fudged our application. They said, we'll just say that you're earning a bit more than you are and it'll all look good and you'll be fine. Mm-hmm. And then I've got a friend who has just been through the complete rigmarole for 15 years of being defrauded out of a house with involvement from the Commonwealth Bank. And I will say that on air with confidence if they'd like to challenge me on that. You know where to find me. And it was just, and that was a result of Keating deregulating the banks. All the overseas competitors came in, and the banks who were at one stage very careful and cautious,
crossing their T's and dotting their I's,
just became reckless. They said, we are not going to let the competition come in and take our business. We're going to give loans to everyone. And they ran rampant. So,
and I guess that's what eventually blew up in the GFC, isn't it?
Yeah. Was that
earlier?
Was that the GFC? Yeah, it was all right. Look, there was so much stuff going on. Well, there was all the deregulation and the cowboys and the profit motive just drove people to do a lot of bad things.
I heard Warren Mosler, who's one of the founders of modern monetary theory, he says giving an institution the ability to create credit or to create dollars, it's like giving a militia AK-47s. Like you really want to have some rules about how you use it.
Yeah, and that certainly came to a head. And look, I know that there are going to be some economic buffs out there who are going to be talking about the reserves and the commercial banks have reserve accounts with the Reserve Bank and I don't care. I don't care about all of the transactions. Yes, I get it. It's complicated, but the net result is that each loan creates a drag on the economy, and the banking sector as a whole creates a drag on the economy because it needs to find interest to facilitate the loans. If you can fault that...
I've got a fault in that.
Yeah? What?
Well, I think ideally the reason that we're the government, for example, is asking commercial banks to do this lending on their behalf in a way is because, isn't the idea that they've got more know-how or more knowledge about their local community so they can see what would be a productive thing to invest in. And so the idea would be that if you give out a loan that's going to increase productivity, then you're not a drag on the economy.
Well, yeah, except that money that is going to be produced has to come from somewhere, and it's not going to come from the banking sector because every loan attracts interest and creates a drain. Those loans need to be facilitated from money that comes from another source other than the banking sector, otherwise you end up with a Ponzi scheme. And the only other source that it can come from...
Where can this be, Kevin?
...is through government spending. We're going to talk about the government sector. This is the other way that money is created. It's when the government spends money into existence through, things that it does. Military always comes up, defence. Then you've got public servants. You've got infrastructure builds.
I always think of the CSIRO.
CSIRO, that's a good thing to think of. I always think of defence because it annoys me. It's such a dumb thing when you've got other things to spend money on.
Can buy submarines with all that money.
Anyway, so the neoclassical economists say that we need to run a balanced budget, that all the money that the government spends needs to be retrieved in taxes. Mm-hmm. And so let's have a look at the consequences of that thing. So to run a balanced budget, as neoliberalism expects, then 100% of government spending would need to be recovered in taxes. The banking sector doesn't add to the national income. Loans attract interest, as we said before, which in aggregate creates a drain. So the government couldn't tax any activity created by bank lending alone because there's no profit being made there. Okay, the profit has to come from somewhere else, but the loans itself doesn't create profit. They create a drain, okay? So this kind of gets interesting, doesn't it? So the government couldn't tax any activity created by bank lending alone. It could only tax on activity created elsewhere. The only other activity would be created by government spending, which means the effective tax rate would be 100%. So the government, because to balance the books, the government needs to recover everything it spends. So there's no. If the banking sector creates a drain on the economy, the only other activity is from government spending. The neoclassical economists say that all that money has to be recovered, which means you have an effective tax rate of 100%.
Never thought of it that way.
To balance the books.
That's the way of thinking about it.
Now, the purpose of money is for the primary purpose of money, which is created by governments, is for governments to provision itself. That's what money is for. In so doing, it creates a private sector. It creates businesses.
Creates markets.
Yeah, it creates enterprises that will then provision the government to build the roads, to build Parliament House, to supply uniforms, to do all that sort of stuff.
Speaking of spending that gets up your nose, the one that gets up my nose all the time is the employment services industry, which is a $6 billion industry. I think every 5 years the contracts are worth about $6 billion. And they have created an entire industry that never used to exist.
Yeah. It privatised a service that is never going to be profitable.
It's of no use. In fact, it does more damage than it does good. So that's an example of how a government spending can create a market.
Now, if a government's going to provision itself, it has to entice people to find those provisions. Who would provide services to the government if they were going to be taxed 100% of what they were paid?
That's a bit of a disincentive, isn't it?
But this is neoclassical economics. They say we need to balance the budget. We need to tax back everything that we spend to balance the budget. They have this fixation on balancing the budget. Okay, now from an MMT point of view, we understand that budgets balance because when the government spends and runs a deficit, the private sector receives and runs a surplus. That's where we see the balance.
That's the balance. We look at both sides of the ledger.
Yeah, and just for a note, when I talk about the private sector, I'm talking about the non-government sector. So I'm including the overseas sector, I'm including state governments, I'm including overseas governments, anybody who is
not the federal government
using the currency, not creating the currency. Okay, so I'm using this broad term private sector. So if we use neoclassical economics and we apply balanced budgets, we end up with the banking sector creating a drain on the economy and the government sector taxing back 100% of what it spent. If you're going to facilitate loans and you're going to have money coming from another source, How does that work?
That was a rhetorical question.
Yeah, there would be no excess reserves left in the private sector. If no reserves are left in the private sector, banks could only lend from the RBA. However, as there are no extra reserves, there would be no way to pay interest, and all loan applications would fail. Because if you can't pay the interest on the loan, you're not going to get the loan. Now, if you can't, the only way you can get the money to pay the interest on the loan is from the government sector, but the government sector is taxing 100% of itself back out again, leaving no money in the private sector. So you go to the bank and you say, I'd like a loan for $100,000. They say you need to pay back 110 over a certain amount of time. How are you going to do that? And they're going to go, I can't. And they go, well, see you later. So no bank loans. So there's no activity in the private sector, right? And all loan applications would fail. So banking would create no private sector activity, and the banks would have no business. The banks would fail. The private sector would collapse, and because there's no government debt, there's no bonds, and so there's no spending of the government paying bonds, paying the interest on bonds into the economy. So none of that exists. If there's no bonds, there's no financial sector. They couldn't get a loan anyway.
What you're saying is they would basically blow up the economy, which has kind of happened in the past. I remember with the Volcker shock therapy, that was a similar thing that was going on, because they didn't understand that, as you were saying, the commercial banks don't look in their vaults to see how much money they've got before they make a loan.
Yeah.
And so Volcker kept jacking up the interest rates to try and stop them from making these loans.
Yeah, I mean, like, who would think that a conservative, well-researched, experienced politician or public servant could make terrible economic policies?
I haven't talked to the MMT economists.
Tariffs.
I think they have a small business mentality, don't they? They're seeing the government as like a small business or like a household where it has to make a profit or it can't spend more than it's earning, that sort of thing.
But they don't understand where money comes from. And this is, like you were talking before about the barter myth. The neoclassical economists don't talk about the origins of money. They see money as this magic thing which just balances transactions. I'll say it facilitates.
That thing.
Yeah.
Transactions.
Facilitates transactions. And they don't even try to explain where it comes from. It's not talked about in economics. What we're seeing here is that the barter myth is a myth. The barter probably came after money, because if you know what something's worth, then you can swap things without having to involve money because you know how much it's worth. We've had that discussion before, and we'll have it again. This analysis, this MMT analysis of the economy, destroys the barter myth because we understand where the money comes from. If you have a paper note, it's written on that. It says the RBA. If you receive a government payment, it will come from the RBA. It's not a mystery. This is not some magical thing.
I haven't been looking to see if Michelle's signature's on there. I remember Phil's used to be on there.
Oh, you'll have to read all that again too, yeah. Okay. So bank lending exists to time shift spending decisions of customers who can save over time. Those savings can only come from government deficits. Conservative economists know this. So they modify government spending to be limited to defence, law and order, business incentives. They cherry-pick the policies that protect their interests, and they promote small government as efficient. But in reality, it's just a cover story to minimise regulation of their profit-driven activity, which is more profitable if their exploitation of labour and resources is not scrutinised. What we're discovering here is that all of these neoclassical economists can't be that dumb. And we know that they sort of know.
They're smarter than us. They know better mathematics than we do.
Well, they're smarter at some things. They're smarter at being smart and being deceitful and deceptive. So what's driving this? And we know from some of these think tanks around the place that what's driving this is profit. This is a profit-driven model. And there are so many reserves in the system from government deficits over the decades. I mean, governments run deficits all the time. And now we know why. They have to. If a government doesn't run deficits, the whole economy collapses. So all of the private sector wealth, all of their profit, all of their savings is derived from government spending that is left in the private sector and not taxed back out again. That's mathematically how it has to be. All challenges accepted. radiommt@gmail.com. Send me an explanation of what I've missed here, because I've been looking at this for quite some time. The private sector is entirely dependent on government spending, and yet they're saying that they want government spending to be small. And this is what creates the stresses on society, because if the government if they're running austerity programs,
Austerity being that they're spending less.
then these corporations that know how things work with government. They lobby them, they fund them, they manipulate them, so that they still get the share, but they're shrinking the pie by saying we need less government spending. Having said that, Ronald Reagan went in with this huge austerity program, and government spending blew out. Abbott came in, the same thing here, saying he's going to cut government spending, and it just kept on increasing. There are things in place which means governments have to spend.
They don't have really much discretion. It just happens due to previous decisions.
Yeah, if people become unemployed, they will receive unemployment benefits if they qualify, which means the government has to spend more. And if you run an austerity program, these things happen. So all of these neoclassical political parties running this neoliberal agenda never succeed in fulfilling their expectations of running surpluses. They can't. And the reason they can't is because the private sector is entirely dependent on government spending to function. Not just a little bit, entirely.
Reminds me of those cults that say, the end of the world is coming next Tuesday, and then it doesn't happen, and they go, it's going to be not next Tuesday, but next Friday.
The next Friday after. Okay. Neoliberalism is an irrational ideology in economic terms, and it is driven by unregulated greed. That's what's pushing it.
You have brutally destroyed their logic, Kevin.
Well, look, and I'll take yous all on. I'm Irish. I'll take every last one of you. Okay. Exploding the neoliberal myth also explodes the barter myth. Money is an instrument of government, not an evolution of private markets. Money is used by government to provision itself, and this creates private markets afterwards. So it's government spending that creates the money, which then creates private markets.
Yes. And back in those days, if we're trying to understand where money evolved from as far as governments or a central authority, it was basically any time you started keeping a ledger of debts and obligations. And once you started doing that, and like the temples would do that in Mesopotamia or whatever.
Yeah.
And once you start doing that, then you've if you add in the next invention, which is you decide that all these different debts are going to be measured according to a single unit of account, and then you make that unit of account tradable, you get currency, and that's how the money evolved, not barter.
Not barter. So the barter myth, gone. Okay. The deficit myth, which is that we need to find the money to balance the budgets, to have balanced budgets. I mean, private sector savings, possibly profits and running costs, are dependent on government deficits. If you want to balance the government spending, you do it by checking both sides of the ledger. If a government has a deficit, there should be a private sector surplus. That's the balance. The balance isn't reducing the government spending to zero. That's just dumb. There's nothing smart about that. The question is not how do we pay for it. The question is what size deficit do we run and who benefits from it.
Yes.
Economists, politicians and journalists need to stop hiding in their ignorance. It is driving me insane.
You cannot do this MMT gig, Kev, and expect there not to be some irrationality out there in the mainstream.
So now that we understand how money works, how the economy works, etc., I'm going to play this Gregorian chant background, and just feel the frustration that we feel when we hear these so-called experts just come out with this dribble.
We've got a budget with unprecedented debt and deficits.
Given the level of debt and deficit, is there any productivity gain to be made by spending money on dog parks?
Given we're talking about debt, you could mention the debt figure for 22-23, just putting it out there for you.
Can you tell us what you expect the annual cost of Medicare, aged care and the NDIS to be in 10 years' time, and how you each believe the growing demand for these services should be paid for?
Now, given there's $1 trillion debt, do either of you have the courage to propose a levy to fund the NDIS?
When's the reckless spending going to stop?
Given the level of debt and deficit,
Unprecedented debt and deficits.
Given we're talking about debt,
Given there's $1 trillion debt.
How you each believe these services should be paid for.
When's the reckless spending going to stop?
debt and deficit,
Debt.
$1 trillion debt.
debt deficit,
Debt.
debt
Debt and deficits.
debt.
deficit.
You're listening to Radical Radio 3CR.
It's just frustrating, and to hear like intelligent people like Laura Tingle, who I told you I've got a slight crush
on her.
Well, she's smart and she's very presentable, and others, and they're not asking the right questions. They're supposed to be there to ask the right questions. That's their job, to scrutinise, but they won't have these conversations.
They're caught up in that deficit myth.
They support this neoliberal agenda. They're supposed to be impartial, but by asking these inane questions, they are being very partial to neoclassical economics, which is founded on misinformation right from the very beginning. The barter myth is the foundation of a flawed economic ideology.
It is part of the frustration, isn't it? Because that was from the previous election, those comments, and it's like you can just wheel them out every time there's an election.
It doesn't change. It goes on for decades after decades, and here is the burden of the MMT understanding, is that once you understand this, you hear these conversations and you just bang your head on the table going, can just stop.
You also get a bit of entertainment value out of it. You know, when you were saying before that the neoliberals want the government to stop spending or ratchet down their spending, and they want the government to run a balanced budget. And remember in those years when the government did run a surplus, in fact, under Peter Costello, under the Liberals, that meant that when they were spending, they were no longer creating bonds, and suddenly the finance sector realised they didn't have one of their favourite safe assets anymore.
Yeah, so they said, we need bonds, and they're going, well, we don't need bonds because bonds are supposed to be, there for government debt.
Supposedly borrowing.
Yeah, that's supposed to be their purpose. And you go, well, and then you find out what bonds are really for. Yeah, it's like you wonder how stupid things can get. How decisions. People in very high positions can make just crazy, stupid decisions. Now, we've got a great example in the US at the moment.
We do.
And now this is something I heard on social media. So I understand that it's not fact checked and it needs to be checked, etc. However, this is the story I heard. It says this is how Trump jumped on the tariff bandwagon. During his first term, he was into tariffs.
He was doing tariffs in his first term. Yeah.
This came about, according to this social media thing that I heard. Was it his son-in-law? Was searching for an economic advisor, and he caught the attention of this book that was called Death by China, which was a book by a fellow called Peter Navarro. Now, Peter Navarro is fairly substantial in the Trump circles at the moment. So Peter Navarro came in as an advisor, and he's a big tariff man, right? He's going, right, you need tariffs. So it was done because his son-in-law, Jared, I think it is, saw the title of this book, said, this sounds good, got this guy in. And Peter Navarro said he's developed his theory on tariffs from an expert, from another expert, and the expert that he got the information from was a fellow called Ron Vara, and he quotes Ron Vara in his book.
That name doesn't mean anything to me.
No, and so Ron Vara is this tariffs expert. Turns out that Ron Vara is fictitious, and Ron Vara is actually just a rearrangement of Peter Navarro's surname. Navarro turns into Ron Vara, and that's the expert that is advising Peter Navarro, who is advising Donald Trump that tariffs are a good idea.
This is someone's alter ego who's advising the federal government over there in the US.
You want to see how far neoclassical idiocy can go.
Just have to dig a little bit. It's only
it's no, okay. So there's a social media post. Fact check it, please. It's not reliable. That's what I heard. Right, I heard it just this afternoon. I thought that is hilarious.
That's classic.
If that's true,
Hilarious.
that just explains everything. You know, the idiocy, the irrationality of the neoclassical economists is there to see. This is not a mystery. And I said it on our last show, I'm going to say it again on this show, ABC, you are the government institution that is supposed to be fair and impartial. Give MMTers a go. Give us a go at explaining. You ask these questions, how do we pay for it? We'll answer how you balance a budget. You balance a budget by checking the government sector with the private sector, and they balance. They have to balance.
It's accounting. It's national accounting.
And that's not the question. The question is, when a government spends a deficit, as in general it must, occasionally it can run a surplus. Okay, there's such a reserve of deficits of government, so-called debt, that they can run a surplus, as was run by the Labor government just recently. But every time they run a surplus, the private sector contracts because that's ledgers, that's money in, money out.
Coming from.
Okay, so ABC. 7:30 report. Anybody? I don't care. Give us a go, and I'll fact check this myself. I'm going to be meeting with some people who know far more than I do, and I will be running this argument past them again. Apparently, we've done this before, and this goes back to Kalecki, the Polish economist who was around the same time as John Maynard Keynes back in the 30s, but he was Polish and nobody read his stuff because it wasn't English. He went through all this stuff 60 years ago. We can see from Curtin and Chifley that they had an understanding of the banks that we don't have today, you know,
Well, that's what you and I are doing, Kev. I think we're trying to demystify what these neoliberals have mystified and pulled the wool over everyone's eyes about debts and deficits, and we're just trying to demystifying and let people know that if you and I can understand this stuff, anyone can.
Yeah, and I am deliberately not being an academic. I'm not going to go and do the courses because I don't want to get dragged into that talk. I want to be able to explain this in layman's terms, and so I hope that I've been able to explain in pretty basic terms how money is created and how the economy works, and why the neoliberal or the neoclassical ideology is insane. It's
illogical, and when they're talking during election about how we need to export gas to get money. No, that's not why we need to.
All of their talk revolves around making rich people richer. That's their prime motivation. What really upsets me with the Labor Party, who I used to be a member of, is that they're buying into this conversation. They're not trying to change the narrative. They're basically rolling over and saying, okay, well, if we're all neoliberal, then we'll be neoliberal too. Not good enough. Not good enough for a party that's supposed to.
But you will hear the usual arguments come out during election time. You'll hear things like them saying that if you're going to be fiscally responsible, that means you have to be revenue neutral. So there's all this jargon that goes on.
Yeah.
What that means is they think they have to have a balanced budget.
Well, they need to try and run a surplus, which is bad. To be fiscally responsible, they need to spend into the economy, and they need to make sure that money goes to the right people. And that is not making rich people richer. That is looking after ordinary citizens who have to struggle. And you talk about cost of living pressures. There's so much they could do if they abandon this irrational ideology. And that we've got a Labor government in power at the moment. I think they're probably going to win the next election. Whether they win it with an outright majority or whether they have to deal with a minority government situation. And I personally would prefer that. I think that makes for better government if they scrutinise more. They need to address this stuff. And if they want me to stop slagging them off, then start changing your language and start becoming more – have these conversations with us.
Yeah, because then you get to talk about what we really need to be spending the money on.
Yeah. Anyway, I think that's enough of me ranting and raving.
Fantastic, Kev.
Was that okay?
Yeah.
I normally just come in and throw grenades, and so
it's a good overview. It reminded me of a few things.
Oh, good. Yeah, rightio. Okay, so anyway, that's what's been in my mind. That was prompted because I touched on this a couple of weeks ago, and you said no, you need to rehash that.
I did.
So that's my extended rehash. Hope that was better. Hope it made sense.
Kev's extended play.
But we got to go. We got people hovering at the door, and the next show, Mafalda, is coming up. So catch you next time. See you, Anne.
See you then, Kevin. You've been listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev.
We'd love your feedback. Email us on radioMMT@gmail.com or search Radio MMT on social media.
Listen to this show anytime wherever you get your podcasts or on 3cr.org.au/Radio MMT.
Support this show and the station by subscribing to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
We thank all our guests.
And we thank economist Professor Bill Mitchell and his mmted.org, educating the masses on modern monetary theory.
And thank you to our listeners for listening. And I thank you, Kevin.
And I thank you, Anne. So what's planned for next week?
Kevin, there is still so much to talk about. We've got to expose all this rotten economics.
Well, no, that's good, and I get it. Do you reckon we could use a bit more music?
Well, I made a list of all these terrible economic theories. Like I've heard of the...
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.